The sun was warm, the breeze off the ocean was perfect, and I was finally relaxing on the porch of my beach cabin. No meetings, no noise, just the sound of waves and a cold drink in hand. Then Karen showed up, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, marching across the sand like she owned the shoreline. "You can't sit here," she snapped. "This is HOA-protected beachfront. You're trespassing." I didn't even get a word in before she was on the phone with 911, reporting a non-compliant squatter. Well, she didn't know. That squatter owned the entire parcel, including the dune she stood on. And 6 minutes after she made that call, I made one of my own. By the end of the week, her entire HOA board was disbanded. There's something sacred about the ocean when it's quiet. No tourists, no umbrellas crowding the sand, no screaming radios or volleyball matches. Just the steady crash of waves, the breeze coming in off the tide, and the smell of salt hanging in the air like a promise. That's what my beach cabin gave me, peace. It wasn't some luxury mansion or modern coastal villa. It was weathered wood, a creaky porch swing, and shutters that rattled in the wind. The kind of place that's been in a family long enough to collect stories, not just upgrades. I inherited it from my grandfather, who built it by hand back when the whole shoreline was just dunes and driftwood. Back then, there was no HOA, no patrols, no rules taped to fences, just landowners, fishermen, and quiet folk who minded their own. So when I pulled up that Saturday morning, coffee in hand, duffel bag in the passenger seat, ready to do absolutely nothing but breathe, I wasn't looking for conflict. I just wanted to sit. I hadn't been out in months. Work had me buried, and the city was starting to feel more like a cage than a home. I needed the beach. I needed this porch. So I unpacked, swept off a few cobwebs, and settled into the old wicker chair facing the sea. The air was still. The sun was gentle. I could hear gulls somewhere out near the tide pools. I'd only been sitting for 20 minutes when I heard the footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Not sand, gravel. Fast, firm steps with purpose. I turned and saw her coming. Mid-50s, maybe older, tall, and stiff like someone who carried authority as armor. Tan visor, pressed khakis, pastel cardigan, and, of course, a clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. The unofficial uniform of HOA royalty. I didn't know her name yet, but the moment I saw her, I knew exactly who she was. She stopped at the edge of my property line and stared at me like I was the problem. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "You're not allowed to be here," she said sharply. I blinked. "Pardon." This is private, HOA-controlled beachfront. Only members are permitted to use the facilities beyond the walkover. That includes the dunes, the shoreline, and this lot. She pointed not just at the sand, but at my cabin. I laughed, a little confused. "Ma'am, I think you're mistaken. This is my family's property. We've owned it since before this HOA even existed." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you have proof of that? Do you normally walk up to people relaxing on porches and demand to see deeds?" She didn't flinch. "I'm the HOA president. We've had problems with squatters pretending to own abandoned or undeveloped lots. We take beach access control very seriously." "Well," I said calmly, "you're going to want to be very careful with what you accuse me of next. Because I assure you, this property is not abandoned, it's not undeveloped, and I'm not squatting." She scoffed and took out her phone. "If you refuse to leave, I'll be calling 911. I raised an eyebrow. "You're seriously calling the police on me for sitting on my own porch?" "You failed to produce proof of ownership," she said flatly. "I have an obligation to protect this community." That word, protect, hit differently when spoken like a threat. She didn't even give me a chance to respond. She turned her back and started talking to dispatch like I was some criminal squatter loitering on a public bench. "Yes, I have a trespasser at Lot 12B, West Dune Access. Refusing to leave private property. Male, late 30s, uncooperative. Possibly armed." Possibly armed? I hadn't even stood up. At that point, it wasn't about the cabin anymore. It was about the principle, the audacity, the abuse of fake power hiding behind community protection. She ended the call and folded her arms, standing there like she'd already won. "You'll be removed shortly," she said smugly. "You can explain yourself to the sheriff." 6 minutes later, 2 deputies pulled up. Real ones. Uniforms, badges, body cams. I stood up calmly as they approached, hands open and visible. "Afternoon, officers," I said. "Let me guess. You're here about the trespasser." The taller deputy nodded. "We got a report. Mind telling us what's going on?" I gestured to the porch behind me. "My name is Jacob, and this cabin belongs to me. It's been in my family since 1968. I've got the deed on my phone and a printed copy inside if you prefer." The other deputy looked over the porch, then back to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation showing this property is under HOA jurisdiction?" She stammered. "Well, no, but all beachfront within the preserve is protected." "It's not," I said. "The HOA was founded in 1992. This cabin was built in '68. It was never signed into the charter. The property line stops 50 feet east of here." I handed the deputy my printed copy. He took one glance and nodded. "He's right," the deputy said. "This parcel is privately owned and exempt from HOA jurisdiction." Karen's face paled. "There must be a mistake," she insisted. "He's not a full-time resident. The bylaws say." "Bylaws don't override deeds," the deputy cut in. She tried to recover, but the damage was done. The officers stepped aside with her, voices low, but I didn't need to hear it. I could see the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders dropped and her lips tightened into a silent scowl. Her eyes darted back at me, not with confusion, but with quiet fury. She called 911 to assert her power, and it had blown up in her face. The deputies returned, offering a short apology for the inconvenience and assuring me there was no issue. Karen didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, each step stiffer than the last. I watched her go, letting the quiet settle again. But I wasn't angry. I was awake, because this wasn't about one porch confrontation. It wasn't about one false call or one badge Karen didn't have. It was about how many others she'd done this to. How many property owners have been harassed, cited, or run off the beach by someone who'd made herself judge and jury over land she didn't even own. She tried to evict me from my own legacy with a phone call and a bluff. And I decided right then, sitting back down on that porch swing, she picked the wrong cabin. Because I wasn't just going to prove her wrong. I was going to take her entire board down with her. After the 911 incident, most people would have moved on, chalked it up to a power-hungry HOA president and let it be. But I couldn't. Not after the way she spoke to me. Not after she filed a false police report. And definitely not after she tried to claim my family's cabin like it was part of some community she didn't help build. No, I needed to know, how far did this go? So I started digging. And what I found was worse than I expected. It began with a walk, just a slow loop through the neighborhood near the beach, clipboard in hand, same as hers. Except I wasn't making notes about lawn lengths or mailbox colors. I was making notes about conversations. I started asking questions. Polite ones, calm ones, and the stories came pouring out. Gloria, 3 doors down, said she was fined for excessive window glare because her sliding glass reflected sunlight during peak hours. Brian, who lived by the eastern lot line, had his deck threatened with demolition because it encroached on dune stabilization zones, even though it had been there since the 80s. Another couple told me they'd been given 2 warnings and a $300 fine for having unauthorized sand toys on the beach on a holiday weekend. None of these people had ever seen the rules they supposedly violated. None were ever given hearings. And none had proof that the HOA even had authority over the areas they were cited for. I started pulling records. First, the HOA boundary maps. Took me 3 days and a few hours at the county office, but I eventually got access to the original charter filings and the parcel overlays that defined where the HOA had actual jurisdiction. They showed a clear outline, and it stopped almost 600 feet from the high tide line, meaning the beachfront, including several of the homes Karen patrolled, wasn't actually under HOA control at all. I printed the maps, highlighted every property outside the boundary. My cabin was one. Brian's was another. Even the public beach walkover wasn't technically theirs. It was a shared use zone maintained by the county's coastal management office. Karen had claimed dominion over land that wasn't even under her board's legal scope. I filed that under strike 1. Then I started looking into HOA meetings, specifically how Karen became president. No election records. No ballots. Just a mention in a 2-year-old newsletter that she was appointed interim president after the former board lead stepped down. No term limits. No election. Just Karen. One resident, Carol, told me. She just kind of took over. One day, she was handling sign-ups for the 4th of July cookout. Next day, she was handing out citations. Strike two. Then came the financials. I made a formal request under the HOA's transparency clause, asking to view how funds were collected and distributed, specifically fines and enforcement expenditures. I didn't expect them to honor it. They didn't. But a former board member, who'd quietly resigned 6 months ago, reached out anonymously. She gave me a copy of last year's budget summary and enforcement spreadsheet. There were line items for things like Coastal Patrol Oversight, $4,700. Community Compliance Drones, $1,300. Noise Regulation Enforcement, $2,250. And the biggest red flag of all, Legal Defense Reserve, $5,000, added just 2 months after Karen took over. That fund wasn't there the year before. I followed the trail to the county registrar's office to see if the HOA had kept its nonprofit status active. Turns out, they hadn't filed their annual documentation in over 18 months. Technically speaking, the HOA was in violation of state nonprofit code. Their board had no legal standing to collect or enforce anything until they remedied it. Strike three. At this point, I had a binder thick with violations, boundary mismatches, misuse of funds, and overreach. But I wasn't done. I submitted 2 official complaints to the State Attorney General's office, documenting the failure to file nonprofit paperwork, along with financial discrepancies and records of unlawful citations on non-member land. To the County Compliance Office, submitting property maps, board minutes, and examples of Karen's abuse of power, including, of course, the 911 call and my own incident report. But perhaps the most important step I took wasn't legal. It was personal. I started speaking up at HOA meetings. Not with rage, not with accusations, just facts. I read directly from county records. I showed side-by-side maps proving the HOA boundaries versus where Karen had been enforcing rules. I quoted the state's nonprofit code, highlighting how a failure file could strip the HOA of enforcement power until reinstated. Some residents were shocked. Some were embarrassed. But most were furious. They'd been bullied, fined, and threatened into silence. And now they knew it was never legitimate. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the one with the receipts. And the more people listened, the more they started to ask questions Karen didn't want to answer. Like why she declared certain beachfront paths restricted when they were public. Or why fines were issued for non-existent quiet hours. Or why election notices had stopped being posted. I knew what was coming next. Karen would try to discredit me, claim I was stirring trouble, sowing division, targeting her. And when she did, I'd be ready, because I had the maps. I had the filings. And soon, I'd have her whole board under scrutiny. There's a moment in every fight when the gloves come off. For me, it was the day I mailed the cease and desist. It was addressed to Lakeshore Preserve Homeowners Association. Attention, Karen Wellington. Neatly printed, professionally written, and backed with one very simple threat. Do not step foot on my property again, or I will sue. But I didn't stop there. The letter laid out everything. That my land was outside their jurisdiction, that I had documentation proving it, and that any future HOA action against me or my cabin would be treated as harassment and trespassing. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't a rant. It was legal pressure, and I knew exactly how Karen would react. Predictably, 2 days later, she sent out a mass email to the entire HOA listserv. It was titled, Community Safety Under Threat. She wrote that certain individuals were trying to undermine the integrity of our beach and falsely claiming ownership of land clearly protected under our bylaws. She called me a legal aggressor and a danger to the harmony of our community. The best part? She CC'd me. She wanted me to see it. She wanted to provoke me. But I didn't bite, because I already had something better than outrage. I had her on record. That email, along with her misuse of the HOA mailing list, became part of the evidence packet I submitted to the State Real Estate Board. along with the boundary maps, the citations on non-member land, the missing election filings, and the HOA's failure to renew their nonprofit license. And then I made another move. I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, citing illegal collection of fines without a valid nonprofit filing, fraudulent representation of authority on land not governed by the HOA, misappropriation of funds, including the so-called legal defense reserve, election fraud due to failure to notify or hold board votes. Each claim was supported with documentation, including screenshots, certified maps, and 3 sworn statements from affected residents. I didn't just tell them Karen was abusing power. I showed them how she'd done it. Then, I made it public. I called for a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting, a real one, hosted on neutral ground at the local community center, not the HOA clubhouse. I passed out flyers. I dropped off invites in mailboxes. I didn't use fear. I used truth. The flyer read, "Concerned about HOA overreach? Come hear the facts. Bring your deed. Bring your questions. Bring your voice." That Saturday, more than 50 people showed up. Some skeptical, some angry, some just tired of the whisper campaigns. I brought a projector, a stack of binders, and a simple mission. Show them what Karen had tried to hide. I opened the meeting by saying, this isn't about fences. It's not about paint colors. It's about power, who has it, who abuses it, and how we take it back. Then I clicked through the slides. A timeline of Karen's takeover. The HOA map overlaid on actual county jurisdiction lines. Budget inconsistencies. The cease and desist. The Attorney General complaint. The nonprofit license that had quietly expired almost 2 years ago. Every piece met with gasps, stunned silence, and whispers turning into loud agreement. Naomi stood up and told the group how she was fined for letting her nephew fly a kite on the dunes. Brian shared his deck violation, despite having permit from the previous decade. Even Carol, the woman who once served on the board, admitted she resigned because Karen had begun bypassing board votes and making executive decisions. By the end of the night, the room didn't feel like an HOA anymore. It felt like a jury, and Karen wasn't there. But the fallout came quick, because 3 days later, the state started calling board members. I didn't hear it directly, but I got texts, emails, even a knock on my cabin door from one of the newer members. She looked shaken. They asked me if I had documentation of my appointment, she said. They're reviewing everything, and Karen's panicking. By the end of the week, 3 more residents had received contact from county compliance officers. One man, a former treasurer, was asked to explain how fines had been tracked and who approved spending. Karen tried to do damage control. She posted a long letter on the HOA portal claiming the state was overstepping and that we were weaponizing bureaucracy. But the truth was out, and people weren't afraid anymore. They stopped paying fines. They questioned every board email. They started attending meetings, not to listen, but to speak. One man stood up during a board session and simply said, "You called the cops on a man for sitting on his own porch, and now the law is calling you." And that was the shift. Karen wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the one being investigated. Her inner circle began to shrink. People she once controlled with rules and reputation suddenly kept their distance. She was a legal liability, a sinking ship, and no one wanted to go down with her. So I made one final move. I sent a petition to dissolve the current board, signed by 40-plus residents. Attached were evidence of violations, copies of complaints filed, a demand to hold a re-election under supervision from the county nonprofit office. And this time, Karen couldn't ignore it, because the county clerk now had her name in an open file, and the Attorney General was already building a case. The board was crumbling, and the storm she started with a 911 call had turned into a full-on takedown. All I had to do now was watch. Karen didn't just lose control. She lost her mind on the way down. The moment the state started contacting board members and compliance officers showed up at property lines with clipboards of their own, Karen switched from denial to full-on retaliation. Like a cornered animal, she lashed out at anything that moved. Her first move? A public letter posted to the HOA portal and emailed to all residents. Subject line: urgent community warning. Misinformation threatens our safety. She called me by name. She accused me of fraud, forgery, and engineering a coordinated legal smear campaign. She claimed I'd falsified county records, bribed local residents, and was seeking to privatize the beach for my own profit. She even attached a blurry photo of me sitting on my porch and tried to paint it as evidence of threatening presence. The image was so calm, me in a lawn chair with a coffee, that it backfired. Residents started forwarding it around with sarcastic captions like, "Dangerous man alert, armed with coffee and common sense." But that wasn't all. Karen filed a formal complaint against me with the HOA Grievance Committee, which, of course, she chaired, claiming I was inciting disorder and undermining official board functions. The problem? There weren't enough people left on the board to even form a quorum. By that point, 4 board members had either resigned or stopped showing up. One had reportedly been served with a subpoena from the county. Another left a voicemail for me personally, saying, "I just want a seat at the table, man. I didn't know she'd drag us into this." With the board fractured and the residents now openly defiant, Karen made her last desperate play. She tried to call an emergency special session of the HOA. Her goal? Pass a resolution banning non-member events on the beach and implement fines for public misinformation campaigns. The problem with her plan? Everyone knew by now that she didn't legally have the power to enforce anything. The notice went out anyway, but this time no one showed up, not even the remaining board members. Instead, the county clerk sent an email the same day to every resident on the HOA mailing list. As of this date, the Lakeshore Preserve HOA is under formal audit for potential noncompliance with nonprofit regulations. Pending the audit, all enforcement activity is hereby suspended. Fines, dues collection, and official notices issued by the current board are considered null and void until further notice. There it was, in black and white. Karen's power? Dead. And with that announcement, the dominoes fell fast. Homeowners stopped paying dues. The official HOA app was deleted by over 100 members in a day. Someone spray-painted "No Queens Here" on the side of the community mailbox kiosk. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. The residents had turned, and Karen was all alone. By week's end, the treasurer submitted a letter of resignation to the county, stating he could no longer in good conscience represent an organization so deeply compromised. That was the final nail. Without a quorum, without a functioning leadership team, and under active state audit, the HOA board was declared legally inactive. The nonprofit registration was marked pending dissolution on the Secretary of State website. I didn't have to do anything else. Karen had collapsed under the weight of her own lies. I just made sure everyone else could finally see it. And then, as if someone flipped a switch, Karen was gone. No notice, no goodbye, no final email. Her house went up for sale within 2 weeks, listed quietly by a third-party agent, priced below market. Rumors swirled about civil liabilities, possible state fines, and even pending litigation, but no one could confirm it. What we didn't know was this. Karen Wellington, Queen of Citations, HOA Enforcer of the Dunes, fake 911 caller, ruler of nothing, had vanished, faded like footprints on wet sand. And the board she clung to like armor? Disbanded. Officially. Legally. Publicly. The HOA that once sent threats for bird feeders and porch flags had lost all authority. Now, the beach was quiet again. Not because people were scared to use it, but because they didn't have to fight anymore. You could feel the change in the air. Families brought chairs out to the sand without looking over their shoulders. Kids flew kites again. People started waving at each other in the mornings, not just as a courtesy, but in solidarity. As for me, I stayed on my porch that next Saturday morning, just like I had weeks before. Same chair, same cup of coffee. Only this time, no one told me to leave. And I knew, from the calm in the wind, to the relaxed smiles of passing neighbors, to the silence of Karen's empty house, that justice had been served. Not just for me, for all of us. The waves sounded different after Karen left. Not louder, not softer, just freer. Without her, the beach felt like it was finally breathing again. Like the weight had lifted from the sand, from the porches, from every unspoken worry we'd carried while pretending her rules made sense. It didn't take long for things to change. The first weekend after the HOA board was officially dissolved, something beautiful happened. People came back. Chairs were unfolded. Umbrellas popped open. Children ran across the dunes without anyone barking violation. No more HOA officers patrolling the walkovers. No more citations for coolers or sunset bonfires. Just laughter. Salt air. The return of something too often taken for granted. Freedom. A group of longtime residents, most of whom had been quiet until now, decided to take initiative. They formed a voluntary neighborhood beach committee, but not one with clipboards and fines. This one focused on community, not control. They coordinated monthly cleanups, posted a calendar for shared events like outdoor movie nights and weekend beach yoga, and even planted native grasses to protect the dunes. No mandats, no power plays, just neighbors looking out for each other. And people responded. The division Karen had built between owners and seasonal visitors, full-timers and weekenders, started to disappear. Fences weren't torn down, but walls? Those came down fast. One afternoon, Naomi brought over a pie and said with a smile, "You didn't just save your cabin. You gave us our beach back." Others nodded in quiet agreement. Brian, the guy whose deck had been cited for dune erosion, invited me to a cookout. Carol, the former board member who'd once been part of Karen's inner circle, apologized for not speaking up sooner and asked if I'd help her design a new beach history board for the community center. Even the kids started calling my porch the safe zone. I didn't ask for any of it, but it meant everything, because that cabin, it had always been my escape, my retreat, my reminder that the world still had peace left in it. I never wanted it to be a battleground, but when it was, I stood my ground. And now it was more than a cabin. It was a reminder that fake power can't stand up to real ownership, that silence enables abuse, and that sometimes one person with the truth, a deed, and a little backbone can tip the balance for everyone else. A few weeks later, the new volunteer group hosted a beach back day. No permits, no dress codes, just potluck food, cornhole games, and a speaker set playing old summer songs. Kids dug sandcastles in places once roped off with HOA signs. Elderly couples walked the tide line hand in hand, and no one asked for permission. That evening, as the sun sank low over the waves, I sat back on my porch and watched it all. The beach, the people, the freedom. The way it always should have been. Not regulated, not policed, not dictated. Shared. A neighbor walked past with her dog and called out, "This place finally feels like home again." And for the first time in a long time, I felt it too. Sometimes sitting on your porch is just relaxing. And sometimes it's how you end a reign of fake power. Karen thought her HOA badge gave her the right to control my peace, to rewrite boundaries, to push people off their own land with nothing more than a clipboard, a smirk, and the threat of a citation. But what she forgot was who actually owns the view. This wasn't about a beach chair or a cabin. It was about the truth, about what happens when someone decides that rules matter more than rights, and control matters more than community. She wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, she became the cautionary tale. So if your HOA pushes too far, don't fold. Don't yell, don't escalate. Just gather facts. Know your boundaries. Document everything. And remind them, the law beats ego every single time. Because when someone calls the cops on you for enjoying what's already yours, they're not enforcing anything. They're gambling on fear. And if you stand your ground with calm, quiet strength, they lose. You don't need a badge to hold power. You just need a deed and the will to defend it. If someone calls the cops on you for using what's yours, remind them that real ownership can't be revoked by a clipboard.